A 45-year-old widow wrote the ad no man would answer. The sheriff wrote a week. The ad was 4 lines. I read it 3 times standing at the post office counter in Mineral Springs, the paper still damp from the envelope, and I can tell you exactly what those 4 lines said because I memorized them before I even got back to my horse. Widow, 45 years. Small cattle operation, good water north of Harlan County, seeking a steady man for honest partnership. No drunks, no pretenders. That was it. No talk of loneliness, no sweetness, no word about what she looked like or whether she could cook, just the facts of the land and the hard line at the end. No drunks, no pretenders. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket, and rode out of Mineral Springs without buying the salt I'd come for. That was a Monday. I didn't leave for Harlan County until Thursday. 3 days I kept the thing in my coat and didn't touch it, and I'm not sure what I was waiting for. Permission, maybe. Some word from somewhere that a man like me was the kind she meant. I was 51 years old. I'd been a deputy in 2 counties and a sheriff in 1. I had a rented room above a hardware store and a gray horse and a cedar box under my bed where I kept a photograph of my mother, a folding knife, and $11. That was my life, stacked up and accounted for. I had not been with a woman in going on 6 years. Not for want of trying early on, but there's something about a lawman that women sense, not danger exactly. More like distance, like you're always watching the room instead of being in it. Which fair enough I was. The men in my county respected me. The bad ones feared me. Both things were true and neither one was warm. I'll tell you what I looked like in those days, since it matters to the story. Gray at the temples, had been since 40. A scar above my left eye from a man who'd swung a bottle at me in the dark in a place called Odell's Crossing, which I'd ended up in by accident and resolved by necessity. Not a big scar, but the kind that sits on your face and becomes part of the story people tell about you before you've opened your mouth. I was lean from years of not eating regularly, which is the working lawman's way. You eat when there's time and sometimes there isn't. I had large hands, which I'd always found useful and never found beautiful. My boots were in good repair, because I'd learned young that bad boots will ruin you sooner than bad weather. That's the inventory. Not much to recommend a man on paper. So I don't know why I went. I keep coming back to that and I still can't tell you clean. Something in those 4 lines felt like she was talking to someone real, not the idea of a man. An actual, weathered, specific man. And I had been talked at like an idea for so long that the difference hit me somewhere behind the sternum. I'll say this about the 3 days before I left. On the Tuesday I went back to the post office to see if there were any more details, an address, a name, anything, and the postmaster, a man named Jiff who'd been behind that counter since before I'd come to Mineral Springs, told me the advertiser had come in herself 3 weeks prior to place it. He said it without expression, just information, but I found I wanted to know more. I asked what she looked like. He thought about it, said, sensible woman. Dark hair gone partly to gray. Came in, paid, left, didn't chat. I held that, sensible woman, dark hair gone partly to gray. I'd been a lawman long enough to know that sensible is the word people use when they mean, this person has been tested and they didn't break. It's not a warm word and it's not meant to be. It's a word of respect for someone who's held. On the Wednesday night, last night before I left, I went down to the saloon at the end of Main Street and had 1 whiskey at the bar. Just 1. A man I knew, Dalt Prescott, who ran the feed store, was there and asked me where I was headed since he'd heard I was taking a leave from the sheriff's job. I told him north and west, didn't elaborate. He said, careful of the weather up that way. I said I would be. I walked back to my room and packed what I needed into the saddlebag, spare shirt, spare socks, my shaving kit, a small amount of food, the folding knife, the $11. Left the cedar box under the bed. Left the photograph of my mother, because I was superstitious enough to feel that leaving it was a kind of anchor, like I was telling the room I'd be back even if I wasn't sure I would. Didn't sleep much that last night. Lay there thinking about the range of outcomes. She sends me away the first day. She sends me away the first week. She keeps me on as a hand and nothing more, which would be its own kind of answer. Or, and this was the thing I circled and circled without landing on, she sees whatever it was I thought she was writing about, the specific kind of worn man she seemed to be asking for, and it goes different. I wasn't sure I deserved that last outcome, but I'd stopped believing that deserving was how the world worked years ago. The world gives you what you go after. Sometimes. So I went. I rode northwest out of Mineral Springs on a Thursday morning, cold coming down off the hills. 7 days, more or less, to Harlan County if I kept a decent pace. I didn't push the gray. He was 11 years old and he'd earned the right to set his own tempo on a long road. First day I got maybe 25 miles and camped by a creek that smelled of iron. Made a fire, cooked a strip of salt pork, and lay there listening to the water and thinking about the ad. Wondering how many men had read it and turned away. Wondering if any had actually answered, and what had become of them. Wondering what made me think I had something to offer a woman who'd kept cattle alive through however many winters on her own and still had the bluntness left to write No Pretenders. The creek ran shallow and fast and I could hear rocks turning under it in the dark. I used to fish when I was a boy in a river outside the town where I grew up, and I hadn't fished since I was maybe 20. I thought about that for a while. All the things I'd been before I became a man who kept order in other people's bad situations. I'd been a boy who fished. I'd been a young man who thought he'd run cattle someday. I'd been someone's son, though both my parents were long dead. The lawman had grown up over all of that like a second skin, and somewhere underneath it the original man was still there, quieter, wondering if there was still time. Second day, flatter country. I passed through a town called Dellard's Fork, which had a saloon and a dry goods and nothing else to recommend it. Stopped for water and oats for the gray and rode on. A man sitting outside the saloon called after me, something about whether I was lost. I didn't answer. I've learned that most things people say from saloon steps aren't aimed at you. They're just aimed at the air, and you don't owe the air a response. There was a moment that second afternoon I want to mention because I think it tells something. I came over a low rise and below me was a valley, maybe 4 miles across, and in the center of it a ranch, a good one, smoke coming from the chimney, cattle visible in the pasture, a woman in the yard hanging laundry. Too far to see her face, could have been any age. But she was working with that particular efficiency you see in people who know their work and do it without thinking about it, reach, pin, and there was something in it that caught my chest. Not desire exactly, recognition. A person doing the work of their life and doing it with steadiness. That was what I was riding toward, that steadiness. I'd been around steadiness in men, I'd valued it in deputies, tried to model it as a sheriff, but I'd never sat at a table with it, never had it across from me in the morning. I'd been steady for other people my whole career. I wanted to be steady next to someone who was steady for themselves. I rode on, and the ranch fell behind the rise and was gone. Third day it rained. Cold, flat rain, the kind that doesn't storm and doesn't let up, just sits on the world like a decision. I put my head down and rode. The gray didn't complain. I've always respected that about horses. They've got no use for commentary on the weather. My coat was not the coat for that kind of rain. I'd known it when I packed and brought it anyway because it was all I had. By midday I was wet through at the shoulders and my collar was chafing where the wet wool rubbed. I stopped under a stand of cottonwoods for maybe 20 minutes, let the gray rest, and ate the last of the salt pork cold. Thought about what Dalt Prescott had said about the weather. Thought about turning back honestly. Not because I was fragile, I'd been wet and cold 100 times, but because the rain had a quality of commentary to it, like the world observing this particular trip with some skepticism. I didn't turn back, I rode. That night I camped under a rock overhang and thought about the woman who wrote the ad. I'd started to build her without meaning to. 45 meant she'd probably been married young, Lost her husband maybe 10 years back, maybe less, maybe more. She kept the operation going alone, which meant she wasn't soft. No drunks meant she'd either had won or watched what they did to somebody she loved. No pretenders, that one I kept turning over. That was the line that had the most weight to it. More weight than the land or the water or the honest partnership. She'd had enough of men who showed up as something they weren't. I thought, I don't know what I am anymore entirely, but I know what I'm not, and maybe that's the beginning of an answer. Fourth day the rain stopped and the country changed, got bigger and more broken, red rocks starting to push up through the grassland. I found a trail that ran roughly northwest and followed it. Past a family in a wagon going the other direction, man, woman, 3 children, everything they owned roped down under canvas. The man nodded at me. The woman was nursing a baby and didn't look up. I nodded back and rode on and thought about what they were leaving, and what they were looking for, and whether those are always 2 different things or sometimes the same. I'd left places before. Never looked back much. A man who's been a lawman long enough learns to travel light or he breaks under the weight of everything he's seen. What you carry costs you. I'd left the weight of Calver County behind me 3 years ago after a shooting that was clean and legal and still something I wouldn't name out loud, not even now. Came to Mineral Springs to start again quiet. Took the sheriff's job there because it was small and because nobody in Mineral Springs had ever heard of me. But leaving doesn't mean you go somewhere. I'd been leaving things for years, and the room above the hardware store was where I'd run out of places to go. Not unhappy, exactly. Just stopped. Like a clock wound down, still showing the right time but not moving. 4 lines on a piece of damp paper. That's what got the clock moving again. I've thought about that. All the machinery of a life, the years of decisions, the accumulated weight of things done and not done. And what finally got through was a woman's blunt 4 lines saying, I exist, I have ground, I need someone real. Come or don't. I came. 5th night I made camp and couldn't sleep and lay there with my coat over me looking at a sky so clear and cold it felt like a warning. I thought about turning back. Not because I was afraid of her, because I was afraid of showing up and her looking at me and seeing immediately that I was a man without much left. A worn thing. Functional, maybe, but worn. And her having the grace not to say it but the sense to know it. 51 is not old, but it's not young. And some years cost more than others. I'd never in my whole working life asked for much. I'd asked for the job. I'd asked for a fair hearing when things went wrong and a clear accounting when they went right. That's about the full of it. I'd never asked to be chosen. Something in the structure of the lawman's life removes that option gradually. You become a function, a useful thing, and functions don't get chosen, they get employed. I'd been employed and respected, and never chosen by anyone for myself in going on 30 years. And the specific ache of that was something I'd gotten so used to that I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a noise that's always there. The stars moved. I lay there and the stars moved. I stayed the course. I told myself if I rode all the way there and she took one look and shook her head, at least I'd know. Knowing is always better than the slow rot of wondering. 6th day I crossed into what I reckoned was Harlan County, though there was no sign. Just a change in the land, the grass got greener, there was more water, cottonwoods along the creek beds. You could feel the difference in the air. Somebody had been taking care of this ground, or the ground was just naturally more willing here. Either way, it felt different under the gray's hooves. I asked at a farmstead for the widow's place. Old man there, probably 70, gave me directions without asking why I wanted them. Looked at me once, looked away like he'd already made up his mind about something. I don't know what. Maybe he'd given those directions before and was tired of it. Maybe he could tell I wasn't the first man to come riding up. That bothered me some. I won't pretend it didn't. I rode the last 8 miles with a cold kind of calculation going in my chest, like I was adding things up and the sum kept coming out unfavorable. She'd had men come before, probably, read the same 4 lines and ridden out, and she was still there, alone. which meant they'd come and they'd gone, which meant I was going to ride up and she'd look at me the way she'd looked at all of them and find what she'd found before. I almost camped short of her property, had my eye on a spot where the creek bent, good grass, sheltered from the north. The gray wanted water. But I kept on, I don't know why. Some stubbornness left over from years of doing hard things past the point of comfort. Or maybe just that I'd ridden 6 days, and I was going to finish what I started, same as always. Her property came into view around a long bend, a low house, stone-built, with a wooden addition on the east side that looked newer, and a solid barn behind it, and a corral with maybe 8 head of cattle visible, and a horse I could see was a good one even at that distance, a dark roan, well-muscled. A garden to the south, already turned for fall. A woodpile that was impressive. A woman who'd put up that much wood before winter was a woman who didn't gamble on things she could control. I slowed the gray to a walk coming up the last quarter mile, gave her time to see me coming. A woman alone on a spread like that, you don't want to arrive fast. She came out of the barn before I'd made it halfway up the track, stood there with a pitchfork in her hand and watched me come, not afraid, not welcoming particularly, just watching. I pulled up about 30 yards out and took off my hat. "Ma'am," I said, "I read your advertisement." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "You're the first one came in from the east." "Mineral Springs," I said, "about 7 days." Something shifted in her expression, though I couldn't name what. She said, "Get down then, your horse needs water." Her name was Cora Alding. She'd been a Vestal before she married. She told me that first evening, like it was information I might need. Her husband, Thomas, had died of a fever 5 winters back. They'd had no children, which she said plain, without apology or grief in the surface of it, though I heard what was under it. She'd been running the spread alone since then, with help from a hand named Prentice who came 3 days a week and was 64 years old and not getting younger. She fed me supper that first night. Beef stew, thick and serious, with bread she'd made that morning. I ate 2 bowls and she watched me eat without talking much, and I had the feeling of being assessed the way you'd assess livestock, not unkindly but without sentiment, checking my wind, my hooves, my eyes. After supper she asked me what I'd done with my life. I told her, deputy sheriff, 2 counties, then a 3rd. The years of it, Mineral Springs. She asked why I'd left the sheriff's job. I told her that too, though I'd never told another person the full of it. The shooting. The man I'd put in the ground legally and correctly, and the way I'd had to walk through his family's eyes in a courtroom afterward and watch them try to find something in my face that would make it make sense. There wasn't anything to find. I'd done my job. That was all there was. But I'd looked at myself that night in a mirror above a wash basin and realized I didn't want to keep being the thing that walked through people's worst days and came out the other side unchanged. I wanted to be somewhere where something was being built. Cora listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she said, "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Younger or more broken, usually one or the other with men who answer ads." I said, "I'm some broken." "I can see that," she said. "It's not the kind that makes you useless." She said it like a judgment handed down, not harsh, just exact, like she'd looked at the broken places and measured them the way you'd measure a fence post for whether it would still hold. I slept in the barn that first night. She put out a blanket and a lantern and said she'd talk more in the morning if I was willing. I was willing. I lay there in the dark listening to the cattle move and the roan shift in her stall and thought, I don't know this woman. I don't know this land. I don't know what comes next. And I could not remember the last time not knowing felt like possibility instead of void. The roan came over to the stall partition at some point in the night and put her nose through the slats and breathed at me. I put my hand up and she sniffed it and went back to her hay. That's a horse that's been treated right, I thought. You can tell. Same way you can tell about people. That was the beginning. Not an ending, not a turn, just the beginning of a long particular thing. The second day she put me to work. Dawn, before coffee, she was already out and she handed me tasks like she'd thought about them overnight. 2 posts on the south fence needed resetting. She showed me where the post hole digger was and left me to it. There's something clarifying about physical work when you haven't done much of it. A lawman's work is mostly waiting and watching and then a short period of intensity, and the body between those episodes is mostly just transport. Digging post holes is different. It requires the whole of you, your weight and your arms and your patience with ground that doesn't want to give. I dug and I thought nothing, which was a relief. Just the digger and the dirt and the gray watching me from the fence. I worked until mid-morning when she came with coffee and didn't stay. Just set the cup on the fence rail and went back to the barn. I drank the coffee. It was strong enough to strip paint and I thought, all right then. This is a woman who has opinions about coffee. Prentice showed up around noon. He was a short, bow-legged man with a white mustache and the hands of someone who'd worked hard ground his whole life, and he looked at me the way old men look at things they've seen versions of before. Not unfriendly, just measuring. We worked the south pasture together that afternoon, moving cattle to winter ground. He didn't ask me much. Asked where I was from, I told him. He nodded. That seemed to cover it. On the ride back he said, "She put that ad in 4 papers. You're the 9th man." I didn't say anything. "First 3 were drunks," he said. "She told them to go before they got the horses unsaddled. The next 2 were looking for someone to carry. She can see that from 100 yards, doesn't take long. 2 more were decent enough but young, I think she scared them. And 1 she just didn't like, which she's allowed to do." I said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, "Because she doesn't talk about herself and I've been around long enough to know that's not the same as not having something to say." He looked at me sideways. "You rode 7 days." I did. Most of them came from inside 20 miles. I thought about the spot where I'd almost camped short of her property, the good grass by the creek. I didn't mention it. Prentice said, "She needs a real partner, not a hand and not a charity case. She needs someone with the bones to stand next to her and hold weight." He paused. "You look like you've held some weight." That was all he said about it. The days found their shape. I worked, she worked. We ate together in the evenings and talked, not always easily, but honestly, which is rarer and better. She asked questions that cut to the center of things and she didn't apologize for them, and I found I didn't mind. I'd spent decades being careful about what I showed people. With her, I was tired of being careful. I'll say something about what it was to work that land. I'd grown up on a small place, left it at 17, and since then my relationship with the ground had been exclusively through boots on roads and courthouse steps. Cora's land was different from what I'd grown up on, higher, colder, the grass shorter and tougher, but it had the same quality of requiring attention. You had to watch it. You had to listen to what it was telling you. A fence that was fine last week might be failing this week because the soil moved, and if you weren't paying attention, you'd lose cattle before you saw it. I started learning to pay that kind of attention, and it was different from a lawman's attention, which is about people. Land doesn't lie to you. Land doesn't perform. It just is what it is and demands you see it clearly. Cora was the same way, just was what she was. I valued that enormously. I hadn't known I was starved for it until I was in the presence of it. She told me about Thomas over the course of several evenings, bit by bit, the way you tell something when you've held it a long time. He'd been a good man, she said. Not easy, but good. She'd loved him and she missed him, and she was not confused about the fact that he was gone. "I'm not looking to replace him," she said one night. "That's not what the ad was." "What was it then?" She looked at the table, looked back up. "Evidence," she said. I waited. "Evidence that I wasn't done," she said. "That I wasn't just going to sit here and get older and wait for the ground to take me. Thomas is gone and the ranch is still here and I am still here and I have—" She stopped. pressed her hands flat on the table. I have more living to do, and I'm not going to do it alone if I don't have to. I understood that. It wasn't romance exactly, not yet. It was something more fundamental, a refusal to give up on the shape of a life that included another person. I'd given up on that. Quietly, a few years back, I just let it go. Figured that was for other people. For younger men, softer men, men who hadn't spent their best years watching the worst of what people did to each other. And then 4 lines on a damp piece of paper and a gray horse, and 7 days of writing, and here I was at this woman's table, and she was telling me she was not done. I said, me either. I said it before I decided to, and once it was in the air, I knew it was true. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, like something had been settled, and got up to pour more coffee. 3rd week I was there, something happened that I think about still. I'd gone to town for supplies. The town nearest her was called Ritter's Mill, 12 miles, small but functional, and when I came back the roan was gone from her stall. Cora was in the south pasture on foot, and when I got close enough I could see her jaw set in a particular way. The way I'd learned meant something was wrong that she decided not to be undone by. 3 of her cattle were down, not dead but in trouble, some kind of illness moving through them fast. I turned my horse and went back to Ritter's Mill for the vet, which meant another 24 miles before dark. I rode hard. The vet was a young man named Corbin, barely 30, but he knew his work and he came without argument. We lost 1 animal that night and saved the other 2. Cora stayed out there in the cold until it was decided, and she didn't ask me to stay, but I did. There's nothing particular to say about the hours of it. Cold, waiting, the low sound of cattle in distress, Corbin working, Cora quiet beside me. Around 3 in the morning, when the crisis was past and the 2 surviving animals were stable, and Corbin was packing his kit by lantern light, Cora reached over and took my hand. She just held it, didn't say anything, didn't look at me. Her hand was rough from work, strong, cold from the night air, and she held my hand the way you hold onto something you mean to keep. I stood there and let her, and felt something in my chest that I can only describe as being found. Not rescued, not fixed, found. Like she'd walked into a room where I'd been standing in the dark a long time and said, without words, you're here, I see you, I'm here too. I didn't say anything, neither did she. After a while she let go and we walked back to the house and she made coffee, and that was that. Though it was not that, of course, it was everything. Corbin came back 2 days later to check the animals, and he sat at her table for a few minutes afterward, drinking water, and I watched him look at the 2 of us the way people look when they're trying to figure out what something is. Then he just said thank you for the call and left, and I thought, this is what it looks like from the outside. A man and a woman at a table in a ranch house in Harlan County. I'd never been that thing before. Ordinary, domestic, simple. I'd been a lawman in a rented room for so long that ordinary felt like a word from another language. I was beginning to learn the grammar of it. I stayed through October and into November. We did not speak directly about whether I was staying, not for a while. There was just the work and the evenings and the slow accumulation of being 2 people in the same place regularly enough that the place started to feel different, started to feel like the arrangement was load-bearing. There was a week in late October that I think of as the week things settled, though nothing particular happened in it. It was just 5 or 6 days of hard work, winterizing the barn, checking the north fence line, bringing in the last of her garden before the first hard frost, and in the evenings we sat by the stove, and sometimes she read, and sometimes I sharpened tools, and sometimes we talked, and sometimes we didn't. The quiet between us by that point had changed quality. It wasn't the quiet of 2 people being careful. It was the quiet of 2 people who didn't need to fill the air. I'd been careful most of my life. Not cold exactly, but managed. You learn that as a lawman. You manage the presentation of yourself because your reputation for steadiness is part of what keeps order. People need to believe you won't flinch, so you show them that, whether you feel it or not. After a while, the showing and the feeling become hard to separate. I'd become so practiced at being steady that I'd lost track of whether it was performance or reality. With Cora in the quiet evenings by the stove, the performance stopped being necessary. She didn't need me to be invulnerable. She needed me to be present and useful and honest. Those things I could do without performing them. One morning in November, she came out to the barn where I was doing something minor and stood in the doorway and said, "Prentice thinks you're the right kind of man." I said, "Prentice is hard to impress." "That's why it means something," she said. I set down what I was holding and looked at her. She was standing in the winter light coming through the doorway, her coat on, her hair pinned back, her face wearing that expression I'd come to know, direct and without armor and not apologizing for it. She said, "I'd like you to stay." I said, "I'd like that too." She said, "I mean for good. I mean, I don't want to be careful about it. I'm too old to be careful. I mean for good." The bluntness of it hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. All those years of men carefully wooing women, dancing around the question, and here she was 45 years into her life and she'd lived more than most, and she was asking me straight, no decoration, just, "I want you here. Is that what you want?" "Yes," I said, "that's what I want." She nodded, looked satisfied the way she looked when a thing was decided and sensible. Then she said, "I'll make eggs," and went back to the house. I stood in the barn for a minute and put my hand on the gray's neck, and he turned and looked at me with that big steady horse eye, and I thought, all right, so this is what happened. You rode 7 days, and you answered 4 lines, and a woman said, "I want you here," and you said yes. Simple when you put it like that. It wasn't simple. Nothing about becoming part of someone's life is simple. But the core of it was a woman who'd earned her own way and kept her own ground and looked at a worn, specific, road-dusted man and said, "You, that one, he's what I meant." I'd been a sheriff and I'd been a deputy and I'd been a man in a rented room with $11 and a photograph. And what I was now, what I was becoming, had more weight to it than all of that put together. Not because of what I'd done to earn it, though I try to earn it every day from here on, but because she'd looked and chosen and said it plain, and she was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. Winter came hard that year. Not unusual for Harlan County, Cora said, but hard enough. The first big snow hit in December, 2 feet in 2 days, and it changed the whole character of the work. You don't stop because of snow. The cattle still need tending. The water still needs breaking. The barn still needs mucking. But everything takes longer and costs more of you physically. And the cold gets into places in your body that remind you of your age. I'd been cold before, plenty of times. Standing in the wind on a courthouse step in January waiting for something to resolve. Walking a night patrol in February. This was different. This was cold in service of something that was mine. That distinction matters more than I can explain. The same temperature means something different when you're working toward your own end. I want to tell about one night in particular. December, a week before Christmas, and it was maybe 10 below after sundown and the wind was moving. I'd gone out at midnight because one of the cattle was making noise that wasn't right. Cora had heard it and woke me, and I'd told her to stay in and gone myself. The animal had gotten herself half tangled in a section of the fence that had gone down under the snow weight, and she was in a state. Not injured, just panicked and cold and stupid, the way cattle get. I worked her free in maybe 20 minutes, got the fence propped enough to hold until morning, got her back in with the others. My hands by that point were past feeling much, and I'd gone past the kind of cold where you shiver and into the kind where you're just numb and methodical, and you know you need to get back inside soon. I came back in through the kitchen door, and Cora was there. Not in her dressing gown, which she could have been. She'd gone back to bed, I thought, which was right. Instead she was dressed, had the stove going hot, had water heating. She took one look at my hands and put them between both of hers without saying anything and just held them there while the water heated. Not romantic about it. Just, this is the job, your hands are cold, I am warming them. Matter of fact as everything she did. I stood there in her kitchen with my hands between hers and steam coming off the pot, and the stove ticking, and the storm outside doing what it was going to do, and I thought about the 11 months between the post office in Mineral Springs and this kitchen. The 3 days I'd waited before leaving. The rain on the 3rd day's ride. The spot by the creek where I'd almost stopped short. I thought, every small choice got me to this exact place. Every day I kept going instead of turning back. Every moment I told her the truth instead of the managed version. All of it had accumulated like snowfall, invisible and slow, and then all at once you looked up and the ground was covered, and the shape of everything was different. She said when my hands had some feeling back, the post needed resetting anyway. I've been meaning to get to that section. I said, I'll do it properly in the morning. She said in the afternoon, morning you'll sleep. I didn't argue. I've learned she's right about most practical things. That was December. We were not yet married. We were, I'm not sure what to call it, settled maybe. Decided, in the way 2 people can be decided without yet having made it formal. The formality came in January, but the decision had been made in October when she said I'd like you to stay, and I said I'd like that too, and both of us meant the full weight of what we were saying. I should tell you about how the town of Ritter's Mill came around to me, because it didn't happen immediately, and it's part of the picture. I was a stranger there, and worse than a stranger. I was a man who'd showed up in a widow's barn with no roots in the county and no clear business, except the 4 lines in a newspaper had started. People in small towns watch that kind of thing. They were polite to my face and reserved behind it, which is their right. I wasn't offended. I'd spent enough years reading the temperature of rooms to know when I was being assessed. The sheriff of Ritter's Mill at the time was a man named Caldwell, 20 years younger than me, who came out to the ranch one afternoon in November on some pretext about a fence line boundary and spent most of the visit looking at me sideways. After he left, Cora said, he wanted to know who you were. I said, what did you tell him? She said, that you were who you appeared to be, which was more than most. I don't know what Caldwell did with that information, but he came back 2 months later, different visit, different energy, and asked me over coffee if I'd be willing to consult on a thing he was dealing with, a dispute between 2 ranching families that had the potential to turn ugly. I said I would. It took me an afternoon to resolve it, mostly by listening to both sides separately, and then asking each man what he stood to lose if this went further than it needed to. The answer in both cases was more than the original dispute was worth, and once they'd said that out loud they could both hear it. Caldwell watched me work that afternoon, and when we rode back he didn't say much. But after that the reserve in Ritter's Mill started to lift. People knew Caldwell's opinion was worth something. If the old lawman from the East was square with Caldwell, he was probably square. I'm not telling that to brag on myself. I'm telling it because it mattered to me being known in a place, slowly, honestly, on the basis of what I actually was and did. The whole of my career I'd been known fast as a function, as the badge. Mineral Springs, Calver County, the places before, they knew what I was before they knew who I was. Here, it went the other way. They learned the man before they learned the history, and by the time Caldwell told them about my years of work, they'd already formed their own opinion and the history just sat inside it. Cora had given me that without knowing she was giving it. Just by being the woman she was, in the place she was, and putting 4 honest lines in a newspaper. There's a thing I want to put down about that winter that I haven't said yet, which is this. I had spent 25 years being useful to people in crisis. That's the whole of a lawman's job. People call you when they need you and you come and you handle the thing and you go back to where you came from. You are temporarily essential and permanently peripheral. Nobody calls the sheriff when things are good. You are the bad times man, and the bad times end, and you go back to the rented room. Cora needed me in bad times. The sick cattle, the post, the fence in the snow. But she also needed me when things were fine. Supper, morning coffee, the ordinary work of the day, the evenings by the stove. She needed me to be there whether anything was wrong or not, and that was a different thing, a thing I'd never been to another person. I was afraid of that some. Afraid I'd gotten so used to being the emergency that I wouldn't know how to be the constant, that I'd be good in the crisis and absent in the calm. I watched myself for it that first winter, the way you watch a horse you're not sure of. But it didn't come. The ordinary didn't feel like waiting for something else to happen. It felt like the thing itself. I think I'd been so hungry for permanence, for so long, that when I found it, I just settled into it like ground that's been worked and is ready. We got married in Ritter's Mill in January. The judge there, a woman named Hartley who'd been on the bench 12 years, did the ceremony in her office on a Thursday afternoon. Prentice was the witness. He shook my hand afterward and said, "About time." I don't know what he meant exactly. Maybe just that she'd waited long enough, maybe that I had. Cora put her hand in my arm walking out of that office, and the cold air hit us, and she looked up at me and said, "You need a better coat." I said I knew it. She said she'd been meaning to say something for weeks, but didn't want to embarrass me. I said she could embarrass me any time she liked, within reason. She laughed, actually laughed, which she didn't do often, and the sound of it in that cold January air in a little street in Ritter's Mill, I'm going to carry that. She bought me the coat that same afternoon. Brown wool, heavier than what I'd had, with a proper collar that lay flat. Tried it on in the dry goods, and she stood back and looked at me the way she looked at fence posts, assessing. Then she said, "Yes. That one," to the shop owner, and paid for it herself before I could reach my wallet, and that was that. The coat was her wedding present to me, and I wore it until it wore out, and when it finally gave up, I kept the buttons in the cedar box, the same box I'd sent for from Mineral Springs. I sold the gray the following spring. He went to a good home, a man I trusted, a farmer named Delacroix who had gentle hands and the right pasture. Sold him because Cora had a horse I could use, and because you can only go back so far in your life before you have to let the old traveling weight go. He'd carried me 7 days to this place. That was his whole job, and he'd done it. Standing in Delacroix's yard, watching him lead the gray away, was harder than I expected. Not sentimental exactly, I am not a sentimental man, but something. The gray turned once and looked back, and I thought, "You did your work, old friend. You did your whole work." Prentice retired the year after we married. His son came for him in the summer and took him up to Montana. He shook my hand at the wagon, looked at me that same measuring way, and then said something I've thought about since. He said, "She doesn't tell people what they mean to her. You'll learn to read it." I have learned to read it. It's in the coffee she makes the way I like, which is not the way she likes. It's in the way she checks the south fence at the end of the day and comes back and finds me and says nothing but her shoulder touches mine. It's in the way she said 2 winters ago when I came in sick and she put me to bed with a firmness that didn't invite argument, the way she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at me in that direct way and said, "You're going to be fine." Not a question, not a comfort exactly, an order, her telling the universe how it was going to be. I believed her. I've found that the things Cora tells the universe tend to hold. I want to say something about those 4 lines, because I keep coming back to them. No drunks, no pretenders. She told me once, years in, why she'd added that last line. She'd had a man come to the place before she put the ad out, someone she'd known casually for years, respectable enough on the surface, who'd come around after Thomas died and put on a good show for about 3 months, being what he thought she wanted, saying the right things. and she'd watched him do it and known he was performing, but she'd been lonely enough that she'd let the performance go on longer than she should have. Then something happened. She didn't tell me the details, and the performance stopped, and she saw clearly what was underneath, and she was done. No pretenders, she wrote, meaning, I have already met the pretenders and they did not have my measure, and I know the difference now. 7 days, she said to me that first evening. You came from Mineral Springs. 7 days. And I understood later that she hadn't said it like a compliment exactly. She'd said it like data, like she was noting that I'd done a thing that couldn't be faked. You can fake charm, you can fake respectability, you can fake most things for 3 months if you're motivated. But you cannot fake 7 days of riding northwest through cold and rain towards something you're not even sure of. That's either real or it's nothing at all. I was real, worn and specific and real. She knew it, I think, before I even got down off the horse. I was the right kind of worn. A man who has spent his life in the practical middle of things, who has kept order in bad places, who has seen what happens when nobody stands between the weak and the people who want to hurt them. A man like that develops a certain competence with difficulty. You know how to function. You know how to hold. What you don't learn in that life is how to be held. She's taught me that. Not with softness particularly. Cora's not soft, but she's steady and she's chosen and she means what she does. Every winter she puts up more wood than we'll need, same as she did before I came, because she plans ahead and she's not going to get caught short. But now she tells me the count, this many cords, she says, maybe we need more, and I go cut more, and we put it up together, and that's the whole thing. That's the whole picture. There's an evening I go back to. Maybe 3 months after we married, late spring, the air just turning warm and we'd had a long day, some problem with the north fence, and then a thing with one of the cattle and a long conversation with Abe about something I've since forgotten. We were tired, both of us, and we sat on the step outside the kitchen door after supper and watched the dark come down. Abe came after Prentice, a younger man, 28 years old, big and quiet with good instincts for cattle. He'd come asking for work the autumn of our first full year together, and Cora had hired him on the spot, which surprised me. She was not a woman to move fast on decisions, and later she said she'd known within 5 minutes he was the kind who'd still be there in 10 years. She was right, as usual. At some point she put her head against my shoulder, just rested it there. The way she held my hand in the night with the sick cattle, not demonstrative, not performed, just here, just this is where I want to be. I sat very still. I didn't want to move and disturb it. The stars came out, the way they do out here, not gradually, all at once, like a curtain dropped, and we sat there in the warm dark, her head on my shoulder, and I thought, I rode 7 days for this. I rode 7 days, and I didn't know what I was riding toward, and it was this exact thing. The weight of her head and the smell of the evening and the stars coming out and the ranch quiet around us, the cattle settled, the fences holding, the whole solid fact of a life being built. I was 63 before I had a home, not a place I lived, a home. 12 years of this now. The ranch looks better than it did when I rode up. I'm not saying that like a credit. I'm saying it because we've both worked it and the land has responded to being worked right, which is what land does when you give it what it needs. The cattle are good. The south fence holds. Abe is 38 now and thinking about getting married himself. And Cora has opinions about this that she's keeping mostly to herself, except for the occasional comment over supper. I'm 63, she's 57. We are not young people. We are not going to be young people again. But I get up in the morning in my own house, next to my wife, and I go out in whatever weather it is and work my own land, and at the end of the day she's there. That's it. That's the whole accounting. I think about that some mornings when I'm out early and the light is just starting and the land is cold and still. I think, a woman wrote 4 lines and meant them. A man rode 7 days and meant to. And here we are. Here I am. The folding knife is still in the cedar box. The $11 are long gone. The photograph of my mother is there, same as it was, though the image has faded some at the edges. Sometimes I open the box and look at the buttons from the brown coat, and I think about standing in the dry goods in Ritter's Mill on my wedding day while Cora decided. Yes, that one. That one. I've been a lot of things in my life. Useful things, some of them. Things that needed doing. But I'd never been someone's that one before. Never been looked at and chosen and kept. Never had someone think about me enough to buy me a coat. It turns out that's the thing. Not the heroics, not the cases, not the years of keeping order in places that needed it. Those things were real and I don't dismiss them. But the thing that sits in my chest at the end of a day, warm and solid and permanent, is this. A woman read the country and read the men who came through it and read me, and she said yes. That one is what I meant. Found.